Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I ask that for a reason. In cases like this, patterns don't appear in isolation. They surface only when accounts are placed side by side, across distance and time. What you're about to hear is not folklore, not a ghost story, and not speculation. It is a reconstruction built from documents, measurements, correspondence, and what those records quietly leave out. And the unsettling part isn't what can't be explained, but what becomes disturbingly clear once you see how ordinary systems are able to hide extraordinary harm. In the spring of 1912, the Whitaker family inherited a house that did not entirely exist on paper. The property transfer itself was unremarkable, recorded in the same neat hand as dozens of others that year, stamped, indexed, and archived without comment. The structure was described as a two-story, single-family residence, with ancillary storage, built in the late 19th century and maintained in good standing. There were no encumbrances listed, no easements noted, and no addenda attached. And yet, within weeks of taking possession, the family discovered a locked room that had no deed, no survey, and no inventory ever acknowledged. I first encountered the Whitaker file while reviewing routine probate materials unrelated to this case, the kind of work that involves long hours with little expectation of discovery. What drew my attention was not a dramatic allegation or a witness account, but a discrepancy in square footage that appeared, disappeared, and then reappeared across successive records. The numbers refused to settle. They shifted by a small but consistent margin, just enough to be dismissed as a clerical error and just large enough to represent an enclosed space. At the time, I made a note in the margin and moved on. It would be nearly a year before I returned to it, prompted by a separate reference in a county maintenance ledger that mentioned repairs conducted adjacent to sealed interior access. That phrase did not belong there. Houses have basements, attics, and crawl spaces. They do not, as a rule, have sealed interior access that goes unmentioned everywhere else. Let us return to the inheritance itself. The Whitakers were not a wealthy family by the standards of the period, but they were stable, established, and cautious. The transfer occurred following the death of a distant relative, and with it came a house that had been occupied continuously for decades without incident. Early letters describe the building as solid, if austere, its exterior well kept, and its interior orderly and unremarkable. The family moved in gradually, occupying the ground floor first, while leaving several upstairs rooms closed until the warmer months. It was during this period of partial habitation that the locked room was discovered, not through exploration, but through absence. One of the children noticed that a hallway terminated sooner than it should have. A door frame was present, its molding intact, but the door itself was flush with the wall, its outline visible only in certain light. There was no handle, no keyhole, and no indication that it was meant to open from that side. When the parents examined it more closely, they found that the wall sounded different there, denser, as though something behind it absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. This alone might have remained a curiosity, a quirk of construction, if not for the fact that no corresponding space appeared on the exterior. The house presented a complete facade, windows aligned as expected. Measurements taken from the outside did not suggest any missing volume, and yet the interior geometry refused to reconcile. What happened next was pieced together from a combination of family correspondence and later interviews, most of which were conducted years after the fact and with visible reluctance. The Whitakers attempted, at first, to resolve the matter through ordinary means. They consulted the deed, then the prior deed, then the one before that. They requested copies of the original plans, only to find that none were on file. This was not unusual for houses of that age. What was unusual was the consistency with which the room failed to appear anywhere else. Tax assessments described the house by frontage and lot size, not interior layout. Insurance documents listed the number of rooms in round figures, without itemization. Even a fire inspection conducted several years earlier noted nothing beyond standard access points. It was as though the room existed only when you stood in front of it, and nowhere else. I need to pause here to manage an assumption that often arises at this stage. It is tempting to imagine that the room was discovered and immediately opened, that curiosity overcame caution, and the truth revealed itself in a single decisive moment. That is not what happened. The door was not forced. No tools were applied. Instead, the family did what most people do when confronted with something that does not fit neatly into their understanding of a space. They avoided it. The hallway was used less frequently. Furniture was rearranged to make the door less visible. The children were told not to linger there. In one letter, the mother described the door as a thing we have agreed not to ask questions of, a phrase that would recur later in a different context. This is where the first pattern emerges, subtle enough to be overlooked if you are not looking for it. The house did not announce the room's presence. It waited for it to be noticed, and then it waited again to see how that notice would be managed. For several months, nothing further occurred. The family settled into routines. Seasonal repairs were made. Visitors came and went. And yet the measurements continued to drift. A carpenter hired to install shelving in an adjacent room remarked that his calculations were off by several inches. A delivery invoice noted an unexpected obstruction when moving furniture through the upper floor. Each instance was explained away in isolation. Taken together, they formed something else entirely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What matters for now is this. By the end of 1912, the Whitakers were living in a house that contained a room they could not account for, could not access, and could not locate on any document that purported to describe the building they owned. And they had made a quiet, collective decision not to pursue it. That decision, more than the room itself, is where this story truly begins. After the decision was made to leave the sealed door undisturbed, life in the house settled into something that outwardly resembled normalcy. That appearance is important because it shaped how later events were interpreted and, just as often, dismissed. The Whitakers did not experience an immediate crisis, nor did they report fear in the conventional sense. What they recorded instead, in letters and household notes, was a gradual narrowing of how the house was used. Certain rooms became favored, others were quietly abandoned. Paths through the interior shifted. These changes were never framed as responses to a single cause, but rather as practical adjustments the kind families make without reflection. A draft is here, better light there. Less traffic through an upper corridor. In isolation, none of it mattered. In aggregate, it did. The family's correspondence from this period is revealing precisely because of what it does not emphasize. Meals are described in detail. Schedules are noted. Repairs are cataloged with care. Yet references to the sealed hallway are indirect, couched in euphemism, or avoided entirely. When the space is acknowledged, it is referred to obliquely as that section or the short hall, language that suggests a conscious effort to minimize specificity. One letter mentions that the children were instructed not to play upstairs during the afternoon hours, a rule justified by concerns about noise and safety, though no specific hazard was named. Another notes that the upstairs rooms do not hold warmth as expected, despite the furnace functioning properly and the exterior walls showing no signs of exposure. These remarks appear mundane until you begin mapping them. When placed alongside each other and aligned chronologically, they trace a subtle contraction of domestic life away from the upper interior. I should mention here that no complaints were filed with local authorities during this time. There were no requests for inspection, no inquiries about unregistered construction, and no petitions to amend the deed. This was not negligence. It was restraint. The family occupied a social position that valued discretion and order, and they behaved accordingly. To raise questions about the house would have required acknowledging uncertainty, and uncertainty carried its own risks. Better, perhaps, to treat the anomaly as an inconvenience rather than a threat. That choice would echo later, in ways that were not immediately apparent. By early 1913, the first measurable effects began to appear, though they were not recognized as such at the time. The children's school records show a slight but consistent decline in attendance during the winter months. Absences were attributed to minor illnesses, fatigue, or inclement weather. None lasted long enough to prompt intervention. The parents' own routines shifted as well. Work hours were adjusted. Errands that could have been completed locally were delayed or combined into longer trips away from the house. One diary entry notes relief at spending an afternoon in town, among other voices, a phrase that stands out only because it is not elaborated upon. The house itself was described less frequently, and when it was, the language became increasingly architectural rather than emotional. Walls, doors, and floors. Measurements, angles. The vocabulary of habitation gave way to the vocabulary of structure. This is often where assumptions begin to form, and I want to slow us down before they do. There is a tendency, when reviewing cases like this, to look for a moment of revelation, a point at which the family realizes that something is wrong. That moment does not exist here. What exists instead is a prolonged period of accommodation, during which the house is treated as slightly inconvenient but fundamentally intact. This is consistent with what we know about how people respond to irregularities that do not immediately threaten safety. They adapt, they rationalize, they reduce exposure, and in doing so, they often preserve the very conditions that allow the irregularity to persist. The first explicit reference to sound appears in a letter written in late February of 1913. It is brief and easily overlooked. The writer notes that the house settles unevenly at night, and that certain sounds seem to repeat at fixed intervals. The explanation offered is temperature fluctuation, followed by a reassurance that the noises are not loud enough to wake anyone. This is important. The sounds are not disruptive. They are not framed as alarming. They are simply present. Over the following months, similar remarks appear with increasing frequency, though never in the same words. A tapping that stops when approached. A dull thud was felt rather than heard. A sense that footsteps do not correspond to movement. Each instance is recorded, then dismissed. The family did not compare notes. There is no evidence of a shared discussion about these sensations. Instead, they remained compartmentalized, each person assuming that what they noticed was either unique to them or too insignificant to mention. That isolation of perception is a recurring feature in cases involving enclosed spaces that resist acknowledgement. It prevents pattern recognition. By the summer of 1913, the sealed hallway had become functionally dead space. Furniture placed nearby was not moved. Cleaning schedules omitted it without comment. One child's drawing from this period depicts the house with a noticeably shortened upper floor, the missing section left blank. When asked about it years later, the artist reportedly said that there was nothing to draw there. This is not evidence in the conventional sense, but it is illustrative. The absence had been normalized, to the point that it no longer registered as absence. The house, meanwhile, continued to behave as though the space were occupied. Temperature readings taken in adjacent rooms showed unexplained variation. Repairs made to the plaster near the sealed door failed repeatedly. Hairline cracks reopening within weeks. A carpenter's invoice from August of that year includes a marginal note indicating that the wall does not take well to correction, a phrase that suggests resistance rather than damage. Again, no action followed. The work was paid for. The note was archived. Life continued. What emerges from this period is not a narrative of fear, but one of gradual displacement. The family remained in the house, but they no longer inhabited it fully. Their presence contracted around the anomaly, leaving it untouched and unchallenged. This arrangement might have persisted indefinitely if not for a single procedural decision made toward the end of the year, one that was motivated not by curiosity but by necessity. And that decision, recorded plainly in a maintenance request filed with the county, would bring the sealed room back into focus in a way the family could no longer avoid. The maintenance request that altered the course of events was not prompted by the sealed hallway itself, but by something adjacent to it. In November of 1913, the family submitted a routine request for inspection after noticing a persistent draft along the upper floor, one that resisted sealing and seemed unaffected by weather conditions. The language of the request is careful and restrained. It does not mention the locked door. It refers instead to irregular airflow along interior partitions. The request was processed without urgency and assigned to a county inspector whose surviving notes suggest that he regarded the visit as perfunctory. This matters because it shapes what he did and did not look for. The inspection focused on visible access points, window frames, chimney seals, and exterior walls. No deficiencies were found. Yet the inspector did record something unusual, almost as an aside. In the margin of his report, he noted that one interior wall terminates without corresponding structural explanation. He offered no theory and recommended no follow-up. The report was filed, stamped, and closed. But that sentence would later become one of the most frequently cited fragments in discussions of the case, precisely because it exists at the intersection of acknowledgement and avoidance. The inspector saw enough to recognize an inconsistency, but not enough to pursue it, or perhaps enough to choose not to. Following the inspection, the family did something they had not done before. They attempted to document the interior themselves. This was not framed as an investigation, but as preparation. Letters indicate that they intended to invite relatives to stay during the holidays and wanted to ensure that the house could accommodate them comfortably. To that end, they began taking measurements, sketching layouts, and noting storage capacity. The surviving sketches are rough, clearly not intended for professional use. Yet they are meticulous in their own way, with repeated annotations where dimensions did not align. One sketch shows the upper hallway ending abruptly, the sealed door represented by a shaded block rather than an outline. In the margin, the drafter wrote a single word, shorter. No attempt was made to calculate what was missing, only to record that something was. During this period, the sounds changed. That is the only way the family described it, and even then, they did so reluctantly. The tapping noted earlier became less rhythmic and more diffuse. It no longer appeared to originate from a single point, but seemed to move along the wall, as though tracing the length of a concealed space. These observations were recorded separately, never cross-referenced. One family member wrote of hearing a sound like fingers testing wood. Another described a low-pressure sensation when standing near the door, likening it to the feeling of being underwater without the cold. None of these descriptions prompted action. Instead, they were folded into the existing framework of accommodation. The hallway was avoided more deliberately. The door was no longer mentioned at all. This is where the pattern begins to harden. The house did not escalate through violence or overt threat. It escalated through insistence. The sealed space asserted its presence not by opening, but by narrowing the margin within which it could be ignored. By early 1914, the family's correspondence reflects a noticeable shift in tone. Letters become shorter and less descriptive. References to the house diminish. When it is mentioned, it is described as difficult or demanding, adjectives that are usually reserved for people rather than places. One letter includes a line that would later be quoted repeatedly in archival summaries: "The house asks more of us than we can give." At the time, it was read as a metaphor. In retrospect, it appears less so. The first attempt to access the sealed room occurred not through force, but through sound. One evening, after hearing a sustained noise from behind the wall, the family placed an ear against the door. What they heard was not movement, but something closer to resonance, as though the space beyond was amplifying internal sounds. A cough sounded distant and delayed. Footsteps echoed faintly, though no one else was present. This experiment was not repeated. The door was not touched again. Instead, the family adjusted their sleeping arrangements, moving bedrooms to the lower floor and closing off the upper level entirely during the night. This decision coincided with a marked improvement in sleep, which was taken as confirmation that avoidance was working. It also marked the point at which the house ceased to function as a unified interior. It became instead a series of tolerated zones surrounding a core that was neither entered nor acknowledged. I want to be clear, that none of this was framed as fear. There are no records of panic, no dramatic accounts of terror. What there is, instead, is fatigue. The fatigue of constant adjustment, the fatigue of maintaining a shared silence. This is reflected most clearly in a journal entry from March of 1914, in which the writer notes that the effort of not noticing takes more energy than noticing ever would. That sentence stands out because it contradicts the strategy the family had adopted. It suggests an awareness, however fleeting, that their approach was unsustainable, and yet they did not change it. The reason for that would become apparent only later, when a separate set of records surfaced, revealing that the sealed room had been known to previous occupants and that its omission from the deed was not an oversight, but a deliberate act. But that discovery lay years in the future. For now, the family remained in the house, circled around a space that did not officially exist, expending increasing effort to maintain the fiction that it did not matter. That effort would soon intersect with institutional processes beyond their control, processes that would expose the limits of silence as a strategy. By the middle of 1914, the Whitaker household was functioning under a set of unspoken constraints that shaped daily life more effectively than any written rule. The upper floor existed in name only. Doors remained closed. Lamps were left unlit. Cleaning was confined to areas still actively used. Visitors were guided carefully through the house. Conversations subtly steered away from certain corridors. None of this was announced or discussed. It was simply enacted, reinforced through repetition. What is striking, when reviewing the record, is how quickly this arrangement became normalized. Within less than 2 years, the sealed room had transformed from an anomaly into an organizing principle. It determined movement, dictated schedules, and influenced decisions without ever being directly addressed. This is the point at which the case shifts from architectural irregularity to behavioral pattern, and it is also the point at which institutional structures begin to appear in the background. In August of that year, a routine reassessment of property tax values was conducted countywide. These reassessments were formulaic, based on exterior measurements, lot size, and general condition. Inspectors did not enter homes unless there was a specific reason to do so. The Whitaker House was reassessed without incident, its valuation unchanged. However, the accompanying worksheet includes a curious notation. Under interior square footage, a figure is written, then crossed out, then rewritten slightly lower. The final number is smaller than the original, by an amount consistent with the estimated size of the sealed space. There is no explanation given for the correction. No initials, no date. It simply appears as a quiet adjustment made somewhere between measurement and record. This is the first documented instance of an external authority tacitly acknowledging the discrepancy without naming it. It would not be the last. Around the same time, the family began receiving inquiries about the property that they did not solicit. A letter from a local historical society requested information about the house's construction date and any modifications made since. The request was polite, framed as part of a broader survey of regional building practices. The Whitakers responded with a brief statement indicating that they were unaware of any significant alterations. They did not mention the sealed room. There is no indication that the society pursued the matter further. Still, the exchange is notable. It suggests that the house had entered an institutional field of vision, not as a problem, but as an object of interest. Interest, unlike concern, does not demand resolution. It allows anomalies to persist under the guise of curiosity. Within the household, the costs of avoidance continued to accumulate. One of the children began sleeping with a light on, a change attributed to age rather than environment. Another developed a habit of counting steps when moving through the house, stopping short of the sealed hallway. When asked about it years later, that child reportedly said that the house did not like to be rushed. This phrasing echoes earlier descriptions and anticipates later ones. It suggests an emerging internalization of the house as an entity with preferences, even as no one explicitly articulated that belief. The adults, meanwhile, grew increasingly meticulous in their routines. Meals were taken at fixed times, doors were checked repeatedly, windows were opened and closed according to a pattern that seems designed to maintain equilibrium rather than ventilation. One letter mentions relief at the predictability of these rituals, describing them as keeping the house calm. Again, this language is revealing. Calm implies the possibility of disturbance. Yet no disturbance is named. The first overt conflict related to the sealed room arose not from curiosity, but from practicality. In October of 1914, a plumbing issue required access to interior walls near the sealed hallway. The family faced a choice. They could delay the repair indefinitely, or they could permit a tradesman to work in proximity to the door. They chose the latter, with conditions. The worker was not informed about the room. He was instructed to focus solely on the visible piping and to complete the job quickly. His invoice includes a brief note, stating that the wall adjacent to the work area was unusually dense and resistant to sound, a phrase that mirrors earlier descriptions almost exactly. He did not inquire further. He was paid and dismissed. The repair resolved the immediate issue, but it also marked a turning point. For the first time, someone outside the family had independently noted the same characteristic they had been quietly managing. This convergence did not bring relief. It intensified the strain. The sealed room was no longer just a private burden. It was a feature that others could encounter, comment on, and potentially investigate. The family responded by tightening their control of information. Social visits were reduced. Maintenance was deferred whenever possible. The house became more insular, not because it was unsafe, but because it was difficult to explain. By early 1915, the cumulative effect of these choices began to manifest in ways that could not be entirely contained. One of the adults experienced prolonged exhaustion, documented in medical notes that attribute it to overwork and stress. Another reported headaches that worsened when spending time on the upper floor. These symptoms were treated individually, never connected to the house. The possibility that the environment itself was contributing was not raised in any surviving record. This omission is significant. It reflects the power of prevailing assumptions about what houses can and cannot do. To suggest that a building might exert influence beyond comfort or discomfort would have required a conceptual leap that neither the family nor their physicians were prepared to make. Instead, the sealed room remained what it had always been, a problem that did not officially exist, and yet its effects were increasingly difficult to ignore. The family's letters from this period contain a recurring phrase, sometimes verbatim, sometimes paraphrased. We are managing. The repetition of this reassurance suggests an awareness that management, rather than resolution, had become the goal. That distinction matters. Managing a problem implies acceptance of its permanence. It also implies a willingness to absorb its costs quietly. As the year drew to a close, those costs would begin to intersect with forces beyond the household, forces that did not share the family's interest in silence. The next development would come not from within the walls of the house, but from the paper systems that governed it, systems that had thus far accommodated the anomaly without confronting it. The paper systems that finally disrupted the family's equilibrium were not investigative in intent. They were administrative, indifferent, and routine, which is precisely why they proved so destabilizing. In early 1915, the county initiated a comprehensive review of residential properties in preparation for infrastructure upgrades, including updated utility mapping and future road expansion. The Whitaker House fell within the review area due to its proximity to a planned service route. Notices were sent. Forms were enclosed. Homeowners were asked to verify details about construction dates, interior layout, and access points. These questionnaires were standardized and designed to be completed quickly and without consultation. For most households, they were a minor inconvenience. For the Whitakers, they posed an immediate and unsolvable problem. One question asked respondents to confirm the number of enclosed rooms on each floor. Another requested the location of any sealed or restricted spaces. The family delayed returning the forms, hoping for clarification or exemption. None came. The deadline passed, followed by a polite reminder. Eventually, they responded, leaving certain fields blank and attaching a brief note stating that some interior features were not readily classifiable. This response was accepted without comment. It was not flagged, it was not questioned. And yet, the omission did not disappear. It was entered into the system as an anomaly, one that would resurface later when cross-referenced against other records. This is how bureaucratic memory works. It does not react in the moment. It accumulates. Around the same time, a surveyor was assigned to update the area's structural maps. Unlike inspectors or tradesmen, surveyors operate at the intersection of interior and exterior space. Their task is to reconcile what is visible with what is measurable. The surveyor's notes from his visit to the Whitaker property are among the most technically detailed documents in the file, and they warrant close attention. He recorded exterior dimensions first, then interior ones, noting each discrepancy with precision. His conclusion was understated, but unequivocal. The interior volume of the upper floor was less than the exterior footprint, by a margin too large to attribute to wall thickness or design variation. He did not speculate. He did not suggest hidden rooms. He simply recorded the inconsistency and marked the case for follow-up. That follow-up never occurred, at least not officially. The surveyor's report was filed, indexed, and then effectively buried beneath more urgent cases. But its existence mattered. It represented a formal acknowledgement, however muted, that the house did not conform to its own outline. Within the family, awareness of this report intensified existing tensions. Letters from this period reveal a growing preoccupation with measurement and containment. Furniture was rearranged to maximize distance from the sealed hallway. The children were instructed to avoid certain areas without explanation. One letter mentions that the family considered moving, then dismissed the idea as impractical. The house was not unsafe, it was not condemned. To leave would have required admitting a reason that could not be articulated. Instead, they stayed and adjusted. This period also marks the first appearance of explicit temporal distortion in the records. Several diary entries note that time spent on the upper floor seemed longer than expected. Tasks took more effort. Minutes stretched. These observations were not dramatized. They were noted clinically as inconveniences. Yet they recur often enough to suggest a shared experience. One entry describes a short trip upstairs to retrieve linens that resulted in a delay of nearly an hour, though no interruption was recalled. The writer attributed this to distraction, then questioned that explanation in the margin, adding a single word, unlikely. This marginalia would later be cited by archivists as one of the earliest indications that the house's effects were not limited to sound and space. The sealed room itself remained unopened, but its influence expanded. Sounds once confined to the hallway were now reported in adjacent rooms. The tapping described earlier evolved into a low, continuous pressure, felt more than heard. One family member described it as the sensation of being watched by something that does not blink. This line appears only once, and it is followed immediately by a retraction. The writer crossed it out, and wrote instead that the feeling was probably imagination. The original sentence remains legible beneath the ink. This is a pattern you will see repeatedly. An observation is made, then corrected, then preserved anyway. The act of correction does not erase the original thought, it merely reframes it. By late 1915, the family's social isolation was complete. Invitations were declined, correspondence slowed. The house had become not just a place of residence, but a closed system, one that required constant attention to maintain its internal balance. This is the stage at which many similar cases either resolve through departure or escalate through confrontation. The Whitakers did neither. Instead, they encountered a third option, one imposed from outside: documentation. A request arrived from a regional planning office seeking clarification on the surveyor's findings. The language was neutral, the tone procedural. It asked whether the family was aware of any unregistered modifications or concealed spaces within the structure. This question could not be answered truthfully without breaking the silence they had maintained for years. The family deliberated. Their response, preserved in draft form, reveals the depth of their dilemma. They considered acknowledging the room, then reconsidered. They considered denying its existence, then rejected that as dishonest. In the end, they submitted a statement that neither confirmed nor denied anything. It described the house as consistent with long-term occupancy and referred questions of interior variance back to existing records. This deflection was accepted, but it triggered a chain reaction. The planning office forwarded the file to another department, one responsible for historical properties. That transfer, mundane as it seems, would eventually lead to the most consequential discovery in the case. But before that could happen, the family would face a decision that forced them to confront the sealed room directly, not as an abstraction, but as a physical boundary that could no longer be avoided. The decision that forced direct confrontation did not come from the family's curiosity or courage. It came from deterioration. In the winter of 1916, a section of plaster near the sealed hallway began to fail. Cracks widened, flakes fell, and the underlying structure became visible in a way that could not be ignored. This was not merely cosmetic. The damage threatened to expose internal framing and compromise adjacent rooms. For the first time, inaction was no longer a viable option. The family consulted a contractor they trusted, someone who had worked on the house before and who was familiar with its peculiarities without being explicitly informed of them. The instructions were narrowly defined. Stabilize the wall. Replace damaged material. Do not alter the layout. The contractor agreed and began work in early February. His notes from that week are among the most unsettling documents in the archive, not because of what they claim, but because of how cautiously they are phrased. He recorded that the wall behaved inconsistently under pressure, resisting removal in some areas while crumbling too easily in others. He also noted that the cavity behind the plaster did not correspond to standard framing patterns. Studs were present where they should not have been and absent where they should have been. He paused work and requested guidance. At this point, the family faced a choice they could no longer defer. To proceed, the contractor would have to remove a section of the wall adjacent to the sealed door. This would not open the door itself, but it would bring the concealed space into partial exposure. The family agreed, with conditions. The work was to be done during daylight hours. They would be present. The opening would be limited to what was strictly necessary. These conditions are recorded verbatim in the contractor's amended invoice, which suggests that they were discussed explicitly rather than assumed. On the morning the work resumed, something shifted. Letters written later describe an oppressive stillness in the house, a quality distinct from silence. Tools sounded muffled. Voices carried poorly. One family member wrote that the house felt attentive, a word that appears nowhere else in the correspondence. When the first section of plaster was removed, it revealed not a hollow cavity, but a second interior wall, set several inches behind the first. This alone was unusual. Double walls were not unheard of, but they were rare and typically documented. The contractor measured the distance and noted that the space between the walls was too narrow to be functional, yet too wide to be structural. He attempted to insert a tool between them and was unable to do so. The gap closed around it, or so he later claimed, though he did not include that phrasing in his official notes. What he did record was that the second wall appeared intact, finished, and load-bearing. It was not a temporary barrier. It was part of the house. At this point, the sealed door could no longer be treated as an anomaly. It was connected to a larger, intentional construction. The contractor recommended halting work and consulting an architect or engineer. The family declined. They instructed him to seal the opening and complete the repair as best he could. He complied, but not without adding a final note to his invoice. Client declines further investigation despite structural inconsistency. This sentence would later be cited in professional reviews of the case as the moment when responsibility formally shifted. The family had been presented with evidence that the house contained a concealed, finished space, and they chose not to pursue it. Their reasons are not recorded, but they are not difficult to infer. Investigation would have meant acknowledgement. Acknowledgement would have meant exposure, not just of the room, but of their long-standing silence. The immediate aftermath of the repair was marked by a brief return to equilibrium. The wall was stabilized. The hallway was restored. The sealed door remained flush and unmarked. And yet, the house did not return to its prior state. The sounds changed again, becoming more localized and more insistent. They no longer drifted. They emanated from behind the door itself. Several letters describe a low, steady vibration felt when standing nearby, as though machinery were operating just out of reach. No such machinery existed. The family began to avoid the hallway entirely, rerouting their movements through longer paths. This avoidance introduced new inconveniences and new tensions. Arguments arose over trivial matters, then subsided. Fatigue deepened. One child refused to sleep indoors for several nights, citing a feeling of being crowded. The phrase is unusual, given the size of the house. In April of 1916, the family received a letter from the Historical Properties Department acknowledging receipt of the planning office's referral. The letter requested permission to review construction records and, if necessary, conduct a site visit. It emphasized that the review was archival in nature, not regulatory. This distinction mattered. It framed the inquiry as retrospective rather than corrective. The family did not respond immediately. When they did, they granted permission for record review but deferred any site visit. This partial cooperation delayed matters, but it did not stop them. Over the next several months, archivists began assembling a fragmented history of the house's construction. What they found would reframe everything the family thought they knew. Original permits were missing. Contractor names did not align across documents. A payment ledger referenced materials delivered to the site months after the house was reportedly complete. Most significantly, a marginal note in a builder's ledger described interior completion deferred pending resolution, without specifying what that completion entailed. This note predated the Whitaker inheritance by decades. It suggested that the sealed room was not a later modification, but part of the original design, intentionally left unresolved. When the family was informed of these findings, their response was not outrage or fear, but resignation. One letter from this period states simply, "It was always meant to be there." This acceptance did not bring peace, it brought urgency. The historical department pressed for a site visit, arguing that the concealed space constituted a matter of architectural significance. The family, exhausted and increasingly isolated, agreed under specific conditions. The visit was scheduled for June. It would include an architect, an archivist, and a local official. The sealed room would be acknowledged, but not opened. That compromise would prove untenable. What occurred during that visit would mark the definitive turning point in the case, shifting it from private accommodation to public record. The site visit took place on a clear morning in June of 1916, a detail that recurs in multiple accounts, perhaps because it stands in contrast to what followed. 3 individuals arrived together, introduced themselves formally, and explained their purpose in careful, non-threatening terms. They emphasized that they were there to observe, not to intervene. The family escorted them through the lower rooms first, presenting the house as it was meant to be seen, orderly, intact, unremarkable. Notes were taken, measurements confirmed. The exterior was photographed. Only after this circuit was complete did the group ascend to the upper floor, where the sealed hallway waited at the end of a corridor that had been quietly avoided for years. The door was indicated, not approached. The family explained its presence in minimal terms, describing it as a construction irregularity of unknown origin. The architect listened, then asked to measure the wall. He placed his tools carefully, taking readings without comment. When he finished, he stepped back and repeated the measurements, then did so again. His notes from that moment are sparse, But one phrase stands out: interior termination inconsistent with envelope. It is the language of professional restraint, a way of stating that the house did not add up. The archivist asked whether the door had ever been opened. The family answered truthfully that it had not. The local official asked whether there was a key. There was not. No attempt was made to force the door. Instead, the group discussed documentation. The archivist explained that the house's construction records were incomplete and that this was not unusual, but that the pattern of omissions suggested intentional deferral rather than loss. He asked whether the family was aware of any prior disputes related to the property. They were not. At this point, the visit might have ended. It did not. One of the children, who had been instructed to remain downstairs, came up the stairs unannounced and stood at the far end of the hallway. Without prompting, they said, "It sounds different today." This statement appears in every account of the visit, quoted verbatim. The adults responded quickly, attempting to redirect attention. But the remark had already altered the tone of the room. The architect moved closer to the door and placed his hand against it. He later described feeling a vibration that did not correspond to any known source. He withdrew his hand and stepped back. No one spoke for several seconds. The archivist suggested that, given the anomalies already documented, it might be appropriate to open the door, if only partially, to confirm whether the space behind it was empty. The family refused. Their refusal was calm, measured, and absolute. They stated that the room had never been part of their living space and that opening it would constitute an unnecessary intrusion. The local official noted the objection and did not press further. The visit concluded shortly thereafter. The official report filed afterward reflects this restraint. It describes the sealed room as a feature of uncertain origin and recommends no immediate action. However, the private notes taken by the architect tell a different story. In a letter written weeks later to a colleague, he described the house as a structure built around a withheld element and suggested that the sealed room functioned less as a space and more as a boundary. He did not publish these thoughts. They remained in his personal correspondence, undiscovered for decades. The aftermath of the visit was immediate and profound. The family's sense of containment collapsed. The sealed room, once managed through silence, had been acknowledged in the presence of outsiders. That acknowledgement altered its status. Sounds intensified. Sleep became erratic. One family member reported hearing voices that did not form words but followed the cadence of conversation. Another described a persistent sensation of pressure behind the eyes when standing near the hallway. Medical consultations provided no explanation. The family's letters from this period are fragmented, often unfinished. Sentences trail off. Thoughts are repeated. There is a sense of acceleration, as though time itself were compressing. In July, the family made a decision they had previously dismissed. They would leave the house. This decision was not framed as abandonment, but as temporary relocation. They informed relatives that they needed rest, that the house required further repairs, and that circumstances demanded flexibility. No mention was made of the sealed room. The departure was gradual. Personal items were packed first. Furniture was left behind. By August, the house stood largely empty, though not officially vacated. The family did not sell it. They did not transfer ownership. They simply ceased to occupy it. This liminal state would persist for years, during which the house existed as a property without inhabitants, maintained sporadically but never fully reclaimed. Institutional interest waned. Without occupants, there were no complaints, no observations, and no new data. The sealed room remained sealed, yet its influence did not dissipate. Correspondence from the family's new residence indicates that some effects followed them. Sleep disturbances continued. One letter mentions hearing a familiar sound in an unfamiliar place, then quickly dismisses it. Another describes relief at being away from the house, tempered by a sense of incompleteness. "We left something behind," one writer notes, then adds, "or perhaps it stayed with us." This ambiguity is critical. It underscores the unresolved nature of the encounter. The family had escaped the physical space, but not its imprint. Over time, the Whitakers would rebuild their lives elsewhere. Children grew up, careers progressed. The house, meanwhile, slipped into obscurity. Its records were archived, its anomalies noted but unpursued. It might have remained that way indefinitely if not for a later development, one that reframed the sealed room not as an isolated curiosity but as part of a broader pattern of architectural omission. That discovery would come decades later, through a different set of documents, and with consequences the original occupants could not have anticipated. The rediscovery began quietly, as these things often do, with a box that was never meant to be opened. It surfaced in the early 1940s during a routine reclassification of municipal storage, the kind of administrative housekeeping that rarely produces anything more significant than outdated permits or duplicate tax rolls. The box was unremarkable, cardboard reinforced with twine, its label faded to near illegibility. What drew attention to it was not its contents, but its placement. It had been filed among records associated with property transfers from a different district entirely, one that did not correspond to the house in question. The clerk who found it noted the discrepancy and flagged it for review. Inside were several folders, their tabs handwritten, their pages brittle with age. Among them was a set of architectural sketches that did not match any officially recorded plans. They depicted a house with a familiar exterior footprint but showed, in faint pencil lines, an interior space that terminated abruptly before the back wall. The annotations were minimal, but one phrase appeared repeatedly along the margin: "Do not extend." No explanation accompanied this instruction. The sketches were unsigned, undated, and lacked the professional stamps typical of approved plans. Yet the measurements were precise, consistent with the physical dimensions recorded decades earlier by the visiting architect. This was not conjecture, it was design. The clerk escalated the finding to a supervisor, who forwarded it to a regional historical office. There, the sketches were compared against known records. No match was found. However, a parallel emerged. Similar annotations appeared in the plans of two other houses built within the same decade, in different towns, by different owners. In each case, a room was indicated on early drafts, then deliberately excluded from final documentation. The reasons were not stated. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. These were not errors. They were omissions. Further investigation revealed that the drafts had originated from a single architectural firm, one that had operated briefly before dissolving under unclear circumstances. Its surviving correspondence, scattered across private collections, suggested a preoccupation with containment, with the management of space not merely as a function but as an influence. The firm's lead designer wrote of rooms as active participants in domestic life, capable of shaping behavior through absence as much as presence. These writings were never published. They circulated privately among a small circle and then disappeared. The house, inherited in 1912, now appeared to be part of this unspoken philosophy. The sealed room was not an afterthought. It was the point. The historical office compiled a report summarizing these findings. It was thorough, cautious, and ultimately inconclusive. Without living witnesses willing to speak, without physical access to the sealed space, the report could go no further. It was filed, referenced, and then shelved. Years passed. The house remained empty. Occasional inspections noted its deterioration, but no effort was made to renovate or repurpose it. The sealed room remained intact, its door unbroken. In the late 1950s, a proposal surfaced to sell the property to a development consortium. The plan was to subdivide the land, demolish the structure, and build anew. A preliminary survey was conducted. The surveyor's notes include a brief mention of the sealed room, described as a non-functional interior feature. He recommended its removal during demolition. The proposal advanced to a public hearing. At that hearing, an unexpected objection was raised. A resident, whose connection to the house was never fully clarified, spoke against demolition. They did not cite historical value or architectural merit. Instead, they argued that the house should remain untouched because it was built to hold something back. The statement was dismissed as speculative, and the proposal proceeded. Yet, demolition did not occur. The consortium withdrew months later, citing financial reassessment. No further explanation was offered. The house stood. By the 1970s, interest in the property had dwindled to near nothing. It became a reference point in local lore, mentioned occasionally but never explored. Children were warned away from it, not with stories of danger, but with vague admonitions about respect. The sealed room was rarely mentioned, but when it was described not as a mystery, but as a fact. That house has a room you don't open. The phrasing mattered. It implied choice, restraint, and adherence to an unspoken rule. The final archival development came in 1982, when a graduate student researching early 20th century domestic architecture stumbled upon the earlier report. Intrigued, they traced the firm responsible for the sketches and uncovered a surviving ledger in a private estate sale. The ledger contained entries that referenced commissions using coded language. Rooms were described as active, dormant, or withheld. One entry, corresponding to the house in question, included a single line, "Withheld element integrated." No record beyond initial acknowledgement. The student attempted to publish these findings, but encountered resistance. Advisors cautioned against speculation. Reviewers requested more evidence. The paper was never accepted. The student moved on to other topics. The ledger returned to storage. What remains, then, is not a revelation, but an accumulation. A house built with a deliberate absence. A room designed not to be used, but to exist. A family who inherited it without warning and chose silence over confrontation. Institutions that documented anomalies without resolution. Patterns that surfaced only when viewed across decades. The sealed room was never opened, but it was never inert. It shaped behavior, influenced decisions, and left a residue that persisted long after the house itself ceased to matter. This is the danger of such spaces. Not that they conceal something monstrous, but that they normalize omission. They teach us to live around what we do not understand, to accept gaps as features rather than failures. The house did not demand belief, it demanded compliance, and that, perhaps, is why it endured. What emerged when the records were placed side by side was not a singular mystery, but a topology of restraint. The house ceased to be an isolated case, and instead became a node within a broader pattern of domestic design that privileged omission over expression. When mapped chronologically, the same vocabulary recurred across unrelated documents: deferred, withheld, non-functional, and integrated without extension. These were not the words of fear. They were the words of management. They suggested a cultural comfort with leaving certain elements unaddressed so long as they remained contained. This reframing matters because it shifts the focus from what might have been behind the sealed door to why so many people agreed it should remain closed. The family's silence was not unique. It mirrored an institutional habit of recording without confronting, of noting anomalies without demanding explanation. In minutes from local councils, in marginal notes from inspectors, and in correspondence between professionals, the pattern repeated. Acknowledgement followed by deferral. Concern followed by procedural closure. The effect was cumulative. Over time, the sealed room became normalized, not as a secret, but as a condition. When later occupants passed by the hallway, they did so with inherited caution, a behavior learned not through instruction but through atmosphere. This is how such spaces persist, not through enforcement, but through consensus. The expansion of the pattern beyond the house revealed similar dynamics elsewhere. In other properties designed by the same firm, residents reported comparable adaptations: rooms that were never furnished, hallways that ended without purpose, doors that were measured, noted, and then ignored. The responses were consistent: avoidance, rationalization, and eventual departure. Rarely did anyone attempt to intervene directly. When they did, outcomes were inconclusive at best. One account describes a forced opening in a different house, followed by immediate repairs and the swift removal of all documentation related to the incident. The lesson absorbed by the community was clear. Do not test boundaries you cannot redefine. Over time, this lesson calcified into tradition. The sealed room became a warning without words. Its presence communicated limits. The ethical implications of this are unsettling, not because a room was closed, but because so many systems aligned to keep it that way. The family chose discretion. Officials chose restraint. Professionals chose caution. Each decision, reasonable in isolation, contributed to a collective abdication of inquiry. The result was a space that shaped behavior precisely because it was never engaged. This is the quiet power of omission. It does not coerce. It invites compliance by making alternatives feel inappropriate. The narrator's role in reconstructing this pattern is necessarily limited. The archive does not yield motives, it yields actions. From those actions, we infer priorities. What stands out is not malice, but order. A preference for stability over disruption. A willingness to accept unresolved anomalies if doing so preserves function. The sealed room threatened function not by its contents, but by the questions it raised. To open it would have required redefining responsibility. Who would be accountable for what was found? How would records be amended? What precedents would be set? In the absence of clear answers, the default was preservation through silence. This logic persists beyond architecture. It appears wherever systems encounter elements that resist categorization. The decision is rarely confronted directly. More often, it is to bracket the anomaly, label it exceptional, and proceed as if the rest remains intact. The sealed room thus becomes a metaphor not for hidden horrors, but for institutional habits. It is a physical manifestation of the choice to live with gaps. The family's departure did not resolve the issue. It extended it. By leaving without explanation, they allowed the house to become a repository for unspoken assumptions. Future generations inherited not the space itself, but the posture toward it. The house taught restraint. It taught the value of not knowing. When demolition was proposed and then abandoned, the same posture prevailed. Better to leave the structure standing than to risk uncovering something that could not be neatly refiled. Even after the house fell into disuse, the land retained this quality. Development stalled. Projects failed to advance. Explanations were offered, all plausible, none sufficient. The pattern held. The sealed room did not need to exist physically to exert influence. Its logic had already diffused into the surrounding systems. The absence became portable. This is perhaps the most disquieting aspect of the case. That a single architectural decision could propagate a mode of behavior across decades, shaping choices long after its origin was forgotten. The archive, when read holistically, does not accuse. It documents. It shows how ordinary decisions accumulate into durable norms. It shows how silence can be an active force. The sealed room was never opened, but it was continuously acknowledged. And that acknowledgement, stripped of action, became its own form of maintenance. The question that remains is not what lay behind the door, but what it means that no one insisted on finding out. That question extends beyond the house. It applies wherever systems encounter elements they cannot easily explain. Do they investigate, or do they adapt? Do they document, or do they defer? The case suggests that deferral is often the chosen path, not out of fear, but out of convenience. It preserves order. It avoids responsibility. It allows life to continue with minimal disruption. And yet, it leaves a residue, a sense that something essential has been left unaddressed. What remains at the end of this reconstruction is not a solved problem, but a clarified responsibility. The sealed room does not demand interpretation so much as it demands acknowledgement of the choices made around it. The family inherited a house that contained a space unaccounted for, and they chose not to force an answer. Officials encountered irregularities and chose restraint. Professionals documented inconsistencies and chose not to escalate. Each decision was understandable. Together, they formed a system of quiet agreement that allowed the anomaly to persist without resolution. The sealed room became less a physical feature and more a lesson in how societies manage what they cannot easily explain. It taught that absence can be integrated, that omission can be normalized, and that silence can function as policy. This is why the room mattered, even when it was never opened. It shaped behavior by existing as a known unknown, a boundary everyone respected without fully articulating why. The house eventually fell out of use, but the logic it embodied did not. That logic appears whenever records are closed with notes of uncertainty, whenever questions are deferred in the name of order, and whenever systems choose continuity over clarity. The sealed room was not dangerous because of what it concealed, but because of what it trained people to accept. It trained them to live around gaps, to treat incompleteness as stability, to mistake the absence of crisis for the presence of resolution. When we look back at the family's letters, at the officials' reports, at the architectural sketches marked "Do Not Extend," what we see is not fear, but discipline. A disciplined avoidance of disruption, a belief that some things are better left unexamined. That belief allowed the house to persist as it was, unchallenged and unresolved. It also allowed the family to leave without explanation, carrying with them a sense of something unfinished. The sealed room followed them not as a memory of terror, but as a template for silence. Later generations encountered the house and learned the same lesson. Do not ask too much. Do not open what has been closed. Respect the boundary, even if you cannot name it. Over time, this lesson hardened into folklore, into reputation, into avoidance. The house did not need to defend itself. It was defended by habit. This is the quiet danger of such cases. Not that they reveal something monstrous, but that they show how easily uncertainty can be domesticated, how readily we accept incomplete accounts if they allow us to proceed. The archive does not accuse the individuals involved. It implicates the process. It shows how responsibility diffuses when no single decision appears decisive. The sealed room was never opened because no one could justify being the first to do so. The cost of action was clear. The cost of inaction was deferred. And so, inaction prevailed. The house is gone now, reduced to records and recollections. The room exists only in documentation, in measurements that do not align, and in plans that stop short. Yet its influence remains legible. It remains in the way the case was handled, in the way questions were managed, and in the way silence was preserved as a form of order. This is not a story about a hidden space. It is a story about what happens when societies decide that knowing less is preferable to knowing fully. About how easily we can learn to live alongside uncertainty without confronting it. About how structures, both physical and institutional, can be built to accommodate omission. If you find yourself unsettled by that idea, it may be because you recognize the pattern elsewhere, in records that end without explanation, in decisions that are postponed indefinitely, in spaces, literal or otherwise, that everyone agrees not to enter. These stories matter because they remind us that the most enduring forms of harm are not always dramatic or visible. They are procedural. They are cumulative. They are sustained by ordinary choices made in the name of stability. Remembering them is not about uncovering secrets. It is about refusing to let silence masquerade as resolution. If you want to continue examining cases like this, where the record itself becomes the mystery and the pattern is more disturbing than any single event, consider subscribing so these stories do not disappear back into the margins where they were first written.